Szeretettel köszöntök mindenkit, még mindig itt vagyok az Európa Tanács strasbourgi épületében. Itt van az őszi ülésszak, ezen a héten zajlik. Ugye a parlamenti közgyűlés tagja vagyok, és az előző videóban már elmondtam, hogy 306 politikus, tehát parlamenti képviselő alkotja az Európa Tanácsot, ami egy nagyobb intézmény, mint az Európai Unió, hiszen az unión kívüli európai országok is benne vannak, de egyébként még Törökország is itt van. És hát ezen a héten komoly viták alakultak ki, amelyben én is részt vettem, és hát olyan mondatok is elhangzottak a számból, ami nem nagyon szokott itt ebben a strasbourgi parlamenti épületben elhangozni. A migrációról már beszéltünk, most pedig a koronavírus vakcinákkal kapcsolatos vitában kértem szót. Ugye itt elsősorban az oltatlanok diszkriminációjáról szól ez a vita, illetve arról, hogy csak bizonyos gyártóknak a vakcináját ismerik el. Ez is érdekes dolog. Eddig is tudtuk, hogy globális gyógyszeripari cégek kiszolgálásáról szól ez a történet elsősorban. Most a vitából is kiderült, ebbe is tekintsenek bele.
The next item of the business in the debate on the report titled Preventing Vaccine Discrimination, document 15608, presented by Mrs. Suna Eversdottir on behalf of the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleagues, during the long height of the COVID-19 pandemic, freedom of movement was often severely restricted in the attempt of the respective authorities to lower the rate of infection and to protect our public health systems. In this context, the EU digital COVID certificate, better known as the COVID pass, helped alleviate some of these restrictions so that the holders of this pass could more easily move freely in a world suddenly closed off to many. But this pass was not accessible to everyone equally, and it did not open every door that once was wide open. My report focuses primarily on the different treatment that people vaccinated by different vaccines were subjected to, even when there was no scientific evidence supporting that action. The resolution also recalls a detailed and long-standing criteria for imposing restrictions on the enjoyment of rights protected under our convention, that they must be prescribed by law, that they be imposed in the pursuit of a legitimate aim, and that they are necessary in a democratic society, and of course, last but not least, that they are proportionate to the legitimate aim being pursued. In times of emergency, such as the one created by the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is vital that we keep reminding ourselves of our fundamental rights, and that regardless of the emergency, these cannot be cancelled.
The Committee on Employment and Social Affairs is particularly pleased that the report has taken into account the position of the WHO, the World Health Organization. They are the experts, and the member states should follow their advice. Individual vaccination is not something that only protects our own health, it also protects community health by reducing the likelihood of infection. In the case of the pandemic, it was instrumental in reducing the pressure on our health systems, which at the beginning of the pandemic were on the verge of collapse in some of our member states. When we talk about vaccine discrimination, it's important that we don't forget the most vulnerable people in our societies. Children, people who can't be vaccinated for medical reasons, refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, undocumented migrants. These groups are not always taken into account when decisions are made regarding these matters, and that violates their rights.
But I would like to note something that was actually out of the scope of the report, at least as the rapporteur understood it. And in my understanding, is the biggest, the greatest factor of discrimination. This is poverty. Not so much within our societies, as the vaccine has been distributed through the universal health systems, but between rich and wealthy countries. Look at the numbers. Just 10 countries account for more than 75% of all vaccines administered globally, but in Africa, the second most populated continent, the second biggest continent, corresponds to just the 3.4% of the vaccines. In the first resolution of ours, We stress the fact of the waiver for the patent so as the vaccine to reach everybody. We must insist on that for reasons of global justice. And I think it's a disgrace that the European Union is not supporting this demand, both at the World Health Organization and at the World Trade Organization.
Mrs. President, dear colleagues, this is a crucial debate and a crucial report because it's about vaccine discrimination, but it's also about mandatory vaccination and the discrimination against those who decided not to get vaccinated, who decided, no, my body belongs to me, and who weren't able to go to restaurants, who weren't able to take the train, who weren't allowed to leave the country, who lost their jobs, get the jab or lost your job. That was the most severe infringement on human rights that Europe has seen in decades, and we need to develop a very clear stance about that. And there's one thing I'm really disappointed about. Suna, you drafted a wonderful draft report that you gave into the legal committee. And then in the legal committee, you introduced amendments to your own report, destroyed your own report, and turned it around to almost say the opposite of what you really think. Who pressurized you? We are here to lobby for human rights. We're not here to defend our governments who've lied to us. Trudeau, Biden, Merkel, Scholz, Macron, they've lied to us. We are here to control them. And we are here to stand in for human rights, not for Pfizer, who's made billions and billions of euros hard selling its product on us. And that's why I ask you to approve of the amendments that I've brought in, because they will restore the report to its original version that you had brought in. Suna Avastorje.
In light of this draft resolution, I would like to highlight the situation with the vulnerable groups, particularly prisoners and staff serving in prison institutions. It is well known that overcrowding, poor conditions and high population turnover make prisons highly susceptible to COVID-19. A recent study conducted in 2021 by the Penal Reform International and the Harm Reduction International notes that people detained and also those working in prisons around the world continue to be left behind in COVID-19 relief measures, despite facing heightened risk of infection and illness due to cramped and unsanitary living conditions and lack of hygiene supplies in many detention facilities. Another reason is the poorer health of the prison population compared to the general population. Even in countries with relatively high standards in the places of detention, there have been multiple cases of COVID-19 related infections and the deaths of detainees and prison personnel.
And then the vaccines arrived, miraculous, developed over record time thanks to science. That was the solution. It was felt an undeniable solution, but it did give rise to many concerns, fake news, but hope, wild hopes that this was the ultimate solution. But I think the vaccines arrived, new waves arrived. In order to enable a society to return to its normal course, rules were put in place when it comes to the use of vaccines. I'm talking about vaccine passes, but of course people's lives changed according to their vaccine choice. It created tensions, divisions, and then doubts when it comes to the successive waves, when we had to recognize that vaccination didn't always protect against the virus, so that a person vaccinated could continue to transmit the virus, in particular if they were very ill. So I think there was abuse. I think some countries went too far when it comes to restricting the rights of citizens, but I think it's clear we were sort of flying on our instruments, as it were. And now, colleagues, the situation has changed. There are many cases of COVID. They're increasing. It's a seasonal thing, a seasonal variation, but in a number of countries, 97 to 98% of the population has been in contact with the virus, either because they were ill or through vaccination. We have vaccines that are adjusted to the new Omicron virus. I think barriers.
I call next Mr. László Toroczkai from Hungary.
Thank you, Madam President. The report is absolutely right in saying that all kinds of vaccine certificates actually provide opportunities for discrimination and human rights violations. The fact that while in Russia, for example, the Russian Sputnik vaccine was rated as the best, it was not even accepted in Western countries, clearly shows that from the very first moment, these measures might have been controlled not by science, but by the large pharmaceutical companies hiding behind politics and politicians. In fact, Everywhere, in China, in Russia, in the European Union, and in America, they have apparently been trying to impose vaccines from their own pharmaceutical companies on the people. Business and political interest mattered, not science and not the people. This is how Pfizer's vaccine became the most recommended COVID vaccine in Europe and, of course, in the United States as well. However, Janine Small, who is the president of International Developed Markets at the Pfizer company, recently admitted in the European Parliament that their COVID vaccine was never tested on preventing transmission. So they lied to people all along when governments with huge media campaigns were repeating that you should vaccinate yourself for others. We now know that vaccinated people can also transmit the infection. In the light of all this, it is unacceptable not only that people who have been vaccinated with certain vaccines are discriminated against, but it is also totally unacceptable and pointless that the unvaccinated are stigmatized and discriminated against in any way. This must be stopped. It is our fundamental human right to decide whether we want to get such a vaccine, especially because Pfizer wanted to classify documentation of clinical trials of the vaccine for 75 years, and the European Commission classified contracts for tens of billions of dollars purchases. Yet, the 4.5 billion doses of the COVID-19 vaccine intended for 450 million EU residents were also financed by the taxpayers. Thank you very much.
I already addressed the accusations of Mr. Kleinwetter that I was somehow pressured, so I don't need to do that again. And finally, I wanted to address the comments made by my colleague from Hungary about the Sputnik vaccine. So just to be absolutely clear, we are talking here about vaccines that have been approved or listed by the World Health Organization. And they go through an equally professional and very diligent procedure as the European Medicines Agency. Their method of checking whether vaccines are safe and effective is equal to that of the European Medicines Agency. And that is why there's no scientific evidence to support discriminating against people based on whether they have a vaccine that has been listed by the World Health Organization or approved for emergency use by the European Medicines Agency. Now, Sputnik fulfills neither of these requirements. It's not been approved by the European Medicines Agency, and it's not been listed by the World Health Organization. And that is because the science simply doesn't support it. It doesn't support it as effective, and it hasn't been shown that it works against the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's why it's not on this list. So let's also keep the facts straight. Thank you.